A man vanishes without a trace, and the only clue, a locked forge still warm to the touch. Welcome to Nuit Criminelle. I'm your host, Leo. I'm always curious. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from tonight. Your messages truly bring this channel to life. I read every one. Let's begin. The morning of the Rosewood Garden, fate dawned with the golden serenity of a picture postcard English summer. Bees drowsed in the lavender, bunting fluttered lazily in the breeze, and the church bells of St. Mildred's rang out over the village green like a cheerful promise that nothing could possibly go wrong. It was, as many villagers would later remark with somber irony, the perfect day for murder. Miss Marple, ensconced beneath a striped parasol near the W.I. jam table, sipped her weak tea and observed the crowd with her usual gentle interest. She noted with pleasure that Mrs. Penelope Crowthorne had worn her infamous hat again, a monstrous thing with feathers that quivered like antennae. Old Major Hartford was already 3 sherries deep and discoursing loudly about his exploits in the Sudan. Children ran screeching between stalls while their mothers exchanged pleasantries and subtle barbs over sponge cakes and preserves. In the center of it all stood Gregory Finch, the village blacksmith, a broad, boisterous man whose laugh could frighten sparrows from hedgerows. His forge had been part of Rosewood's life for over 30 years, as dependable as the post and the parish notice board. That morning, he'd set up a small anvil and was giving the children lessons in horseshoe making while puffing on his pipe and handing out peppermints from his waistcoat pocket. "He's a good man," said Mrs. Lorimer, the vicar's wife, as she joined Miss Marple on the wooden bench. "Rough around the edges, of course, but always willing to help. Drove 3 miles in the snow last winter just to repair the church gate. A pity about his niece, though." Miss Marple raised a brow mildly. "Ah, yes, young Iris. Quite the modern girl, I hear. Read those American magazines and wear trousers about the house." Mrs. Lorimer sniffed. "One can only pray it's a phase." The fete reached its peak around midday. The maypole dancers had just concluded their routine to polite applause, and the scones were nearly gone when the vicar, pale and breathless, stumbled onto the green. He climbed the bandstand steps and called for silence, his voice trembling. "I must beg your attention, everyone. It seems that Gregory Finch is missing." A stunned murmur rippled through the crowd. Miss Marple put down her teacup without a sound. "What on earth do you mean, missing?" boomed Major Hartford. "He was due to bring the raffle box from the vestry," the vicar explained, "but no one had seen him for nearly an hour. His niece says he never returned from a walk he took just before the maypole dance." Miss Marple's eyes moved slowly across the green. The anvil still sat in its place, unattended. The peppermint tin lay open, and in the distance, a little boy tugged at his mother's sleeve, holding up something shiny and curved. "Look, Mummy," he said. "I found a horseshoe in the flower bed." But no one was listening, not yet. The disappearance of Gregory Finch descended upon the Rosewood Garden fete like an unseasonable chill, sapping the warmth from the sunlit afternoon. The music faltered, the chatter died into murmurs, and the cheerful clatter of teacups was replaced by the rustle of confused movement and craning necks. A cluster of curious villagers had begun forming near the bandstand, drawn by the vicar's announcement and the unmistakable thrill of something being amiss. Miss Marple remained seated on her bench, quietly observing the swelling crowd. A lifetime spent in St. Mary Mead had taught her that human nature rarely changed, no matter the setting. People gossiped and speculated when frightened. They drew together in suspicion and unease. And yet it was in those very moments, the muddle of confusion and emotion, that truth most often peeked out, quite unaware it was being seen. Mrs. Lorimer was already wringing her lace handkerchief. Disappeared. But how, Jane? I mean in plain daylight. At a fete. Miss Marple tilted her head slightly, watching the group near the smith's anvil. Yes, it is strange, Penelope. Though I've often thought that in a crowd, one can vanish quite effectively, especially if no one is really looking. The boy with the horseshoe was now joined by his mother, who gently scolded him for playing in the flower bed. She plucked the object from his hands, brushing soil from its curve, before giving it a puzzled glance. It was polished and newly made, no doubt one of Finch's morning creations, but its presence, discarded in a rose border, was oddly out of place. She turned toward the vicar to mention it, but he had already disappeared in the direction of the vestry, accompanied by the ever-hurrying Miss Oldbury, who ran the church choir and most of the village behind it. Within 20 minutes, the fete had unraveled. The raffle was cancelled, the last of the sandwiches packed away, and one by one villagers drifted off, some to their homes, others to the nearby forge. Word had spread, as it always did in Rosewood, with the tenacity of ivy on old stone. Gregory Finch was not just late, he was gone. At the center of it all stood Iris Finch, his niece, her arms folded tightly across her cardigan, eyes scanning the green with attention she didn't bother to disguise. She was a tall girl of about 24, with angular features and short cropped auburn hair that defied every local notion of femininity. Her expression was one of clenched impatience, not grief, and she bristled at every question thrown her way. "I told you, Uncle Greg left just before noon," she repeated to Inspector Craddock, who had arrived from the county station with remarkable swiftness, summoned no doubt by a panicked call from Miss Oldbury. He said he needed a quiet smoke. I wanted to walk off the noise. The inspector, a thick-set man with kind eyes and a brisk manner, jotted in a notepad. "And he didn't say where he was going, Miss Finch." "Number? He never did. Just wondered when he needed thinking space. Usually up toward the lane behind the chapel or through the orchard. But I've already looked. He's not there." Miss Marple, having made her way to the perimeter of the conversation with discreet elegance, listened attentively. She did not interrupt yet. Iris's tone had not gone unnoticed. There was more than worry in her voice. There was frustration, perhaps anger. "Did your uncle seem upset this morning?" Craddock asked gently. Iris hesitated. "No more than usual. He hasn't been exactly cheerful lately, if that's what you mean." "And why is that?" he prompted. She gave a tight shrug. "Family things. The forge? Old debts. It's not really your business, is it?" Craddock frowned, but let it go for the moment. "Do you know if anyone had words with him today? Anyone who might have quarreled?" "I doubt it," Iris replied, voice suddenly cold. "Most people around here just pretend to like each other. That's the Rosewood way." The inspector's eyes flicked over the small crowd nearby. Among them stood Major Hartford, who now leaned on his walking stick like a court magistrate, scanning the scene with a veteran's intensity. Mrs. Dalrymple, the postmistress, whispered urgently to her husband, and young Walter Fleming, the quiet clerk from the estate office, stood apart from the rest, staring at the empty anvil with a haunted expression. Miss Marple took a small, precise step forward. "Excuse me, Inspector, but I wonder, has anyone checked the forge itself?" Craddock looked momentarily surprised, then cleared his throat. "We were just about to. The constable has the key from Miss Finch. She always locks up," Miss Marple said softly. "Such a practical girl." Iris looked at her then, the faintest flicker of confusion crossing her features, though she said nothing. The group moved together in a slow procession toward the blacksmith's cottage, which stood a short way down the lane beside the churchyard. The forge itself, a squat stone structure with a sooty chimney and thick wooden doors, exhaled a faint tang of ash and oil even from outside. Constable Marks unlocked the doors and pushed them wide with both hands. Inside, the forge was still. Dust motes danced in shafts of filtered sunlight. The hearth had long since gone cold, the coals grey and resting like a thing forgotten. Tools hung in neat rows upon the wall, tongs, hammers, and chisels, each in its place, without sign of disturbance. But it was the table that drew attention. On the heavy oak surface lay 3 unfinished horseshoes, one polished to a near gleam, another barely shaped. Beside them, a folded paper rested, slightly askew. Craddock moved toward it, unfolding the sheet slowly. It was a bill, a simple invoice from Finch's Forge addressed to a Mr. L. Denham for iron rail repairs. Nothing remarkable on the surface, but Craddock narrowed his eyes. "Denham," he muttered. "Isn't that the solicitor who moved into grey pastures?" Miss Marple nodded, her expression unreadable. "Indeed. Quite recently, too. A widower, I believe." The inspector slid the note into his pocket. "We'll pay him a visit later. For now, let's search the grounds." They spread out, combing the hedgerows, sheds and footpaths. Nothing, no trace of Gregory Finch. It was as though the man had simply evaporated into the summer air. As dusk began to settle over Rosewood, a strange hush fell. Villagers spoke in whispers, glancing over shoulders and latching doors a little earlier than usual. The fete had become a memory already, replaced by something darker, something that gnawed at the edges of every polite conversation and every exchanged glance. That evening, Miss Marple sat alone in her parlour, a neat piece of knitting in her lap, though her needles moved without attention. Her thoughts circled the day's events like moths to a lantern. The anvil, the horseshoe in the flower bed, the unusually early closure of the forge, Iris's tone, the vicar's nervousness, the bill. It was all rather peculiar, not alarming, not yet, but peculiar enough to warrant closer attention. And in Miss Marple's experience, peculiarity was very often a signpost to something much more sinister. By the following morning, the village of Rosewood had transformed from a picture of pastoral charm to a bubbling pot of whispered speculation and quiet unease. The sky, too, had lost its cheerful brightness. A veil of pale grey hung low over the thatched rooftops, as though the weather itself mirrored the villagers' apprehension. The blacksmith, Gregory Finch, had not returned. The forge remained closed, its heavy wooden doors latched from the outside, and its anvil stood like an abandoned monument to a man who had, by all appearances, simply ceased to exist. It was as if Finch had been plucked from the earth with no more fanfare than a weed from a garden bed. And in the silence of his absence, Rosewood did what it did best. It talked. The talk began, as it often did, at Mrs. Dalrymple's post office. "It's not natural," she declared to anyone who stepped over her threshold. Gone in broad daylight, and during the fete, no less. "You mark my words, something bad happened to that man." Behind her, Mr. Dalrymple coughed delicately but said nothing. He had learned years ago that little good came from contradicting his wife in front of paying customers. Miss Hester Pym, the retired schoolmistress, placed a letter on the counter and lowered her voice. "Have the police found anything?" Mrs. Dalrymple leaned in with relish. "Nothing yet. Inspector Craddock's been all over the village asking questions. But between you and me, I doubt they'll get much from Iris. She's always been too clever for her own good and terribly secretive." Miss Pym, who considered herself rather clever as well, nodded solemnly. "She's not like her uncle." Gregory was a simple sort, honest if a bit loud. But Iris, well, she keeps to herself too much. At the village shop, similar conversations unfolded between bins of potatoes and rows of tea tins. Walter Fleming was seen purchasing matches and tinned sardines with a distracted air. He barely spoke a word to Mr. Thomas, the shopkeeper, and didn't meet anyone's eyes. "I never liked the look of that one," whispered Mrs. Ellsworth, a widow with a fondness for mysteries, both literary and real, always skulking about. "He used to work for Gregory, didn't he?" Mr. Thomas scratched his head. "Did odd jobs from time to time. Bookkeeping, I believe. Quiet sort. Too quiet, if you ask me," she replied. But it was not only the younger Fleming who drew attention. Major Hertford, with his habitual swagger and cane, had begun holding court on the corner near the War Memorial. "Mark my words," he told a small gathering. "This is no accident. That man didn't wander off. Number, this was deliberate, planned, cowardly, but planned." "And who would want to harm Gregory Finch?" asked Dr. Ambrose, who had stopped on his way back from the surgery. "Someone with a grudge, or a secret. Possibly both." Miss Marple, who happened to be passing on her way to the greengrocer, paused beside the group, smiling pleasantly. "You sound quite certain, Major." Hertford turned to her with a short laugh. "Ah, Miss Marple, you know I'm never wrong about these things. Years in service teach you how to read people. That Iris girl knows more than she's telling. And that solicitor fellow, Denham, he's as slippery as a bar of soap." Miss Marple adjusted the netting on her straw hat. "Do you think so?" "I know so." She offered a small nod and moved on, but not before noting the tightening of Hertford's jaw and the faint twitch of his hand on his cane. He had a particular interest in this matter, she thought, more than the average villager, more even than the curious widow or the gossiping shopkeeper. It was something in his eyes, not just suspicion, but anger. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple sat with a fresh pot of tea and the morning newspaper, though she hardly read the headlines. Her thoughts turned once more to Gregory Finch, to his confident presence, to the way he'd handed peppermints to children, to the effortless way he'd been part of the village's heartbeat for decades. People like that did not simply vanish. They were not lost. They were removed. A sharp knock came at the door, and when she answered, she found Iris Finch standing stiffly on the front step. "I'm sorry to intrude," the girl said without preamble, "but I heard you've been asking questions. I thought perhaps we could speak plainly." Miss Marple stepped aside and gestured her in. The young woman entered with an air of tense defiance. She perched on the edge of the sitting-room armchair, knees tightly together, and accepted a cup of tea without sipping it. "I know what people are saying," Iris said flatly, "that I had something to do with it, that I know more than I'm telling, but I didn't. I don't." Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap. "I don't think you're lying, my dear. I do think you're frightened." Iris's jaw clenched. "Should I be?" "Only if someone wants you to be." There was silence. "Uncle Greg had enemies," Iris said finally. "He wouldn't have called them if he didn't believe in that sort of thing. But there were people who resented him. The Denham man, the solicitor, was one. There was some trouble over a land boundary last winter." "Oh." "He accused Uncle of encroaching on his property. He said a new fence line ran through his garden, made threats." "What kind of threats?" Iris looked away. "The usual kind, I suppose." "Legal, but his tone wasn't legal. It was personal." Miss Marple sipped her tea thoughtfully. "And were there others?" "Walter," Iris said after a moment. "He worked for us for a few years. Bookkeeping, some orders and deliveries. He was odd. Got jealous of Uncle's reputation. Thought he should be in charge. They had words. Did it come to blows? Not that I saw. But Walter quit without warning in April, and he still owes Uncle money." Miss Marple nodded, letting silence settle between them. "You loved your uncle," she said gently. "Yes, but something changed recently." Iris looked up sharply. "How are you?" Miss Marple offered a mild smile. "You don't wear grief the way most people do, but you wear guilt even if it isn't yours." Iris's eyes shimmered, and for a moment she looked years younger. "We argued the night before the fete. He wanted me to marry someone I didn't love. For security, he said. For the forge. He thought I was being selfish. And were you?" "I don't know," Iris whispered. "I only know I walked away from that argument feeling like everything had cracked between us. And now he's gone." Miss Marple placed a gentle hand over hers. Sometimes, my dear, people disappear not because they wish to, but because someone else believes they should. It's never your fault if you didn't wield the hand. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple paid a quiet visit to the solicitor's house. Grey pastures stood at the far end of the village, a handsome stone property with ivy on its gables and a pair of green shutters at every window. She was received by a sallow-looking man in his early 50s, Lawrence Denham, who wore a mourning band, though no one had died, at least not officially. "Yes, Finch did work for me," Denham said, lips tight. "And yes, we had a disagreement, but it's preposterous to suggest I had anything to do with his disappearance." "I'm not suggesting anything," Miss Marple replied lightly. "Only collecting the pieces." Denham leaned forward. "Let me be clear, Miss Marple. I may be new here, but I understand how these villages work. People point fingers at outsiders. If anyone had a reason to make Finch disappear, it wasn't me. It was someone much closer." Miss Marple's eyes met his, calm and unwavering. "Closer, you say? Someone who stood to gain." She smiled politely and rose to leave, but as she stepped out onto the path, her eyes narrowed. Finch had enemies, but the real question was not who hated him, it was who feared him. The following day broke with a sky the color of pewter and the lingering scent of wood smoke in the air, as if the village itself had drawn in its breath and refused to exhale. The mystery surrounding Gregory Finch's disappearance was no longer a curiosity. It had become a simmering fear, threaded through every conversation, shop counter, and Sunday pew. Miss Marple, who had always found that reflection came best with a brisk walk, took her morning stroll around the outer lanes of rosewood. She passed the vicarage, where the curtains twitched discreetly, and the green, where a few leftover chairs from the fete still stood like forgotten sentinels. A light mist hung above the grass, and in the quietness, the village felt suspended, hovering on the cusp of revelation or calamity. At the forge, a constable stood watch. The building remained sealed, a mute participant in the unfolding drama. Miss Marple didn't approach. She simply paused, long enough to observe a subtle scuff in the gravel outside the door. A dragging mark, curved, faint but not invisible, as if something had been pulled. Not heavy enough for a cart, but not light either. She said nothing and moved on. Back in the heart of the village, Inspector Craddock was making rounds. He was thorough, fair, and possessed a calm manner that set people at ease. Yet Miss Marple had always thought him a trifle too trusting. He tended to believe what people said if they said it convincingly enough. At the moment, he stood outside Walter Fleming's modest lodgings, speaking to the man himself. Walter looked thinner than usual, eyes shadowed with sleeplessness. His hands shook slightly as he handed the inspector a small notebook. "It's what's left of the records I kept for Finch," he said. "I tore out some pages after I left. Personal notes. Nothing to do with the business." Craddock turned the book over. "You kept a double ledger?" Walter's eyes darted. "Not a double ledger, just annotations." He wasn't much good at accounts. "I tried to tidy things. Sometimes he'd miss things and forget what he owed or to whom. I did my best." Craddock nodded. "And when was the last time you saw him?" Walter hesitated. 2 nights before the fete. He stopped by the Swan, bought a pint, left before dark. Didn't say much to me. Did you have reason to speak to him again after that?" Walter's mouth tightened. "Number I didn't." From her place across the street, Miss Marple caught the lie. It was small but unmistakable. The flicker of the eyes, the too quick response. Walter Fleming had seen Gregory Finch after that night. The question was why he would hide it. Later, that morning, Miss Marple received a visitor, Reverend Lionel Thorne, the village vicar. Tall, thin, and kind-eyed, the Reverend had served Rosewood for nearly 15 years, and carried the sort of serene patience that only came from managing both souls and tempers in equal measure. "I find myself troubled, Miss Marple," he said as he sipped tea on her garden bench. "Not only by Mr. Finch's vanishing, but also by the turn in the village's mood. There's a hardness coming in, a suspicion." "That's very observant of you, Reverend," she replied, gently stirring her own cup. "Fear has a way of drawing out the shadows in people, and the shadows here run deep." He nodded solemnly. "Iris Finch came to see me yesterday. She asked about grief. Not in the spiritual sense, but in the practical one. How long it takes, how it changes people. I believe she's feeling something very particular and very private." "She feels guilt," Miss Marple said softly. "Not for causing her uncle's disappearance, but for not preventing it. She knew something was wrong, but did not speak." The vicar exhaled slowly. "Yes, that was my sense as well." They sat in silence for a moment. "I also wonder," he added, more hesitantly, "about Major Hertford. He and Mr. Finch had a history, an old disagreement never truly laid to rest. Something about a purchase of land near the woods years ago. No one talks about it now, but it caused bitterness at the time." "Bitterness lingers," Miss Marple mused, "even when the cause is forgotten." "Would you speak to him?" the vicar asked. "He might say things to you he would not say to me." That afternoon, Miss Marple found Major Hertford on his porch, polishing a pair of old binoculars. He greeted her with a mixture of suspicion and politeness. "Miss Marple," he said, "came to ask if I've buried poor Finch under the rhododendrons." "Nothing so dramatic, Major," she replied calmly. "Though I was curious about your recollection of a dispute with him, something to do with land." He blinked at her, the cloth pausing in his hand. "Ah, so we've turned to ancient history now, have we? That business was over and done with. He claimed a patch near the western lane was common land. I disagreed. We settled it. Eventually. And were you satisfied with the outcome?" He snorted. "It doesn't matter whether I was or wasn't. The law spoke, and that was the end of it." "But resentment has a long shelf life," Miss Marple said. Hertford looked at her closely. "You think resentment made me kill him?" "I think resentment makes people foolish. It makes them careless with words and sometimes careless with actions." He set down the binoculars. "Listen here, I've nothing to hide. Finch and I had our quarrels, but I've fought in 2 wars and buried better friends. I wouldn't hurt the man. Truth is, he was more than just the village blacksmith. He knew things. Such as..." Hertford's eyes flicked away. "He heard things. He saw things. It's a small village. People forget how much they pass. Through forged tools, carts, locks, letters, and whispers." Miss Marple nodded, absorbing the implication. "And did he ever hint at knowing something worth hiding?" "No," the Major said quietly. "But lately, he's been different. Distracted, watching people too closely. I thought perhaps he had some secret of his own." Back in her cottage, Miss Marple reviewed the pieces. A respected tradesman vanished without a trace. A niece with unspoken regrets. A solicitor with property disputes. A former assistant with secrets in his ledger. A war hero with a long memory. A vicar aware of moods. Everyone had touched Gregory Finch in some way. But who had reason to remove him? That evening, the weather broke. Rain swept in over the village in gusts, rattling windows and flattening the garden roses. Miss Marple lit a lamp and sat by it, her knitting forgotten in her lap. She saw the picture forming, but it was still missing a corner. A motive, a moment, a spark. Then, just before midnight, there was a knock at her door. Iris Finch stood outside, soaked through, her face pale and drawn. "You were right," she said. "I didn't tell you everything, but I have to now. Something's happened." Miss Marple stepped aside to let her in. Outside, the rain fell harder, and somewhere, in the dark heart of the village, a truth waited to be unearthed. Rain streamed down the windows of Miss Marple's cottage in slender rivulets, catching the amber glow of the oil lamp as Iris Finch stood shivering in the hallway, her hair slicked to her brow, clothes clinging to her as if the rain had tried to swallow her whole. Miss Marple, calm as ever, ushered the girl inside with quiet efficiency, placing a thick towel around her shoulders and guiding her to the hearth, where a fire still glowed from earlier in the evening. "I didn't know where else to go," Iris said, her voice barely more than a whisper. "I kept telling myself it was nothing, just nerves. But then I found it." Miss Marple, crouching to add another log to the fire, gave no outward reaction. She simply turned her face slightly so Iris wouldn't see the sharpness of interest in her eyes. "Found what, my dear?" Iris took a moment, drying her hands before reaching into her coat pocket. She drew out a folded piece of paper, slightly crumpled and blotched with moisture. "I went to the forge. I know the constable was supposed to be keeping it sealed, but the back door wasn't locked, and I knew where Uncle used to hide things, in the hearth, under the old bricks where the ash settles cold." Miss Marple took the paper delicately, smoothing it out on her lap as she leaned into the light. The writing was uneven and hastily done, but unmistakably Gregory Finch's. "If anything happens to me, look at the ledger. Walter knows. But not all of it. Some things I kept back for safety. There's someone who wants silence. Iris, don't trust too easily. Things aren't what they seem." Miss Marple read it twice before folding it again and tucking it beneath her saucer. "When did you find this?" "Just now. I was too scared to take it to the inspector. I didn't want them thinking I was hiding more." "You were frightened," Miss Marple said gently, "and you were right to be. But there's more, isn't there?" Iris swallowed. "Yes. That night, the night before the fete, Uncle had a visitor. Late. I was upstairs, reading. I only heard bits of it through the floorboards, but I could tell it was an argument. Low voices, but intense. When I came down in the morning, he said nothing about it. Just made breakfast and acted like everything was normal, but I could tell something had changed." Miss Marple gave a slow nod. "Did you recognize the voice?" Iris hesitated. "Number, but it was someone local. I could tell by the way he spoke. And something else. He said the name Hartford. I'm sure of it." That name lingered in the air, heavy and cold. Miss Marple stood and moved to the sideboard where she kept a simple notebook filled with scribbled observations and half-finished thoughts. She didn't open it. Instead, she looked to the girl with a kind, assessing expression. "Did you ever see your uncle afraid, Iris?" "Once. Just once. Last winter. He came home white as a sheet, hands shaking. He said he'd seen something in the woods that wasn't meant to be seen. He wouldn't say what. Outside, the rain battered the windows with renewed force, and the wind wailed faintly under the eaves. Miss Marple poured 2 fresh cups of tea. She placed one in front of Iris and settled herself again with the ease of someone who knew how to wait for things to unfold. "Iris, I want you to be careful over the next few days. Say little. Watch everything. I believe your uncle may have uncovered something unfortunate. And someone knew it." "You think he's dead, don't you?" Iris asked, eyes wide with dread. Miss Marple paused. "I think he was silenced. Whether by death or threat, we don't yet know. But people don't write notes like this unless they fear something very real." The next morning, the rain had passed, leaving the village washed and glistening. The birds sang as though unaware of the tension laced through the air. News of a break-in at the forge had already reached Inspector Craddock before breakfast. He stood outside the smithy, hat in hand, expression grim. The rear latch was forced. "But not recently," he said. "Likely the night of the fete. Maybe before." Miss Marple, having arrived just minutes after, listened quietly. "And what of the hearth?" she asked mildly. Craddock blinked. The hearth. It's where a man who works with iron might hide something fireproof, wouldn't you say? He narrowed his eyes, but didn't question her. A few moments later, a constable called from inside. "Inspector, something's here beneath the ash." Craddock entered, and Miss Marple followed at a dignified pace. From beneath a loose brick, the constable drew out a metal box, no larger than a loaf of bread, its lid scorched and bent. Inside lay several folded papers. Some were receipts, others old letters, and one remarkably intact was a copy of a land deed. "Grey pastures," Craddock murmured, frowning. "That's Denham's property." Miss Marple leaned over his shoulder. "Not quite. That's the name, yes, but the deed predates his purchase. It's from 1938. Look closely at the second line." Craddock scanned it again. Then his brow furrowed. Major Charles Hartford. He was the owner before it was sold to Denham, a sale that was, by some accounts, rather hurried and poorly documented. Craddock looked sharply at her. "You think Finch had this, and someone wanted it buried?" "I think he stumbled upon it," Miss Marple replied. "Perhaps during one of his minor repair jobs at the house. A document misfiled, perhaps tucked behind a loose panel, and once he realized what it implied, he hid it until he could decide what to do. And what does it imply? That the transfer of grey pastures was not entirely lawful, or at the very least, that someone profited unfairly." Craddock whistled low. "That's the motive, then. But is it enough for murder? Pride, reputation, land. In villages like Rosewood, Inspector, those are the currencies of power. The document was placed in evidence, but already it had done its part. The village buzzed that day. The return of the constables to the forge sparked fresh rounds of speculation. At the Swan, the landlord swore he'd seen Walter Fleming arguing with a man in a dark coat behind the stables the night before the fete. At the post office, Mrs. Dalrymple claimed the mayor had sent a curious telegram weeks earlier, though she couldn't remember to whom. But none of it led directly to Finch. Not yet. That evening, Miss Marple sat in her garden, fingers absently winding her knitting as twilight settled over the hedgerows. The land deed, the ledger, and the letter. It all pointed to something large and buried. And the man at the center, Gregory Finch, had almost certainly known he was in danger. She looked out toward the tree line in the west, beyond the village path, the woods where Finch had once come home, pale with fright. He had seen something, and whatever it was, it had made him dangerous to someone who preferred the world remain just as it was. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the gate. It was the vicar, breathless, his robes dusted with leaves. "Miss Marple," he said, "you must come. Something's been found in the chapel crypt." She stood, calm but alert. "What sort of something, Reverend?" He swallowed. "A boot and a trail of dried blood, leading to one of the old bricked-up chambers." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. The forge had led her to the papers. Now the chapel would lead her deeper into the dark, and whatever lay beneath Rosewood's foundations, it was ready to be uncovered. Twilight clung to the stone arches of St. Mildred's like a velvet curtain as Miss Marple followed Reverend Thorne across the churchyard. The damp smell of moss and old limestone hung in the air. A half-moon had risen, casting a silver sheen over the crooked gravestones, while the wind rustled gently through the yew trees that lined the path. Inside the chapel, the shadows were deeper still. The vaulted ceiling loomed above like a slumbering cathedral, and the air bore the weight of centuries. Lanterns had been lit and placed near the pulpit, casting long flickers of light over the worn flagstones and pews. At the rear of the church, a small group had gathered. Inspector Craddock, Constable Marks, and the vicar's caretaker, Mr. Biddle, a hunched man with a bad hip and a tendency to mutter when nervous. Miss Marple's footsteps were soft as she approached. "It's just over here," said Craddock, gesturing toward a narrow arch behind the organ, the old crypt entrance. Sealed off years ago, but the mortar must have loosened. Someone's dislodged the bricks. Not by accident, I presume, said Miss Marple quietly. No, Craddock agreed grimly. Not by accident. Mr. Biddle, holding a flickering lantern, led the way down a shallow flight of stone steps. They descended into the cool breath of the earth. The air grew heavier as they moved, tinged with damp stone, decay, and the faint, metallic scent of blood. The passage opened into a small, vaulted chamber. Cobwebs clung to the arches, and the floor was layered in dust except for one area where the dirt had been disturbed. Against the far wall, a pile of recently shifted bricks lay scattered, revealing a dark hollow beyond. Just inside the broken recess, half hidden by shadow, was a boot. Craddock knelt and pulled it gently free. The leather was scuffed and damp, the sole thick with old mud. There was no foot inside. "It's his," said Iris, who had come with them but remained near the stair. Her voice was low. "Uncle Greg wore those every day." Craddock nodded. "And this." He pointed to a faint smear along the stone floor, a dark brown trail leading into the narrow cavity. "Dried blood," said Constable Marks, confirming what everyone had suspected. They widened the opening with care. Behind it lay a second chamber, older still, unused for decades. The lantern light spilled across more flagstones, and there, half hidden beneath a collapsed wooden beam, was the unmistakable outline of a man's form. Craddock stepped forward with measured tread. They uncovered the body in silence. It was Gregory Finch. His face was pale, slack in death, though his expression bore a trace of grim defiance, as though he had seen his end coming and faced it head-on. There were bruises along the side of his temple, and a wound at the back of his head told its own story. No weapon lay nearby, but the message was clear. He had not died by accident. Miss Marple stood at the threshold, unmoving, her face unreadable in the dim glow. Craddock rose slowly, brushing dust from his trousers. "Well," he said at last, his voice low, "now it's no longer a disappearance. It's murder." The next morning, the village of Rosewood awoke to grim headlines and a heavy silence. The blacksmith was dead. Murdered. Hidden beneath the church he had repaired, worshipped in and tended with quiet devotion for over 3 decades. The impact was immediate. Shutters stayed closed longer than usual. Conversations dried up when strangers approached. The bell at St. Mildred's did not ring, and yet behind every drawn curtain, speculation boiled. It was Walter Fleming, insisted Mrs. Dalrymple over tea with Mrs. Ellsworth. He worked for Finch. I knew the church, had keys probably. It's always the ones who fade into the background. "I think it's Iris," countered Mrs. Ellsworth with dramatic relish. She was always too clever. A girl who doesn't cry, there's something unnatural about that. At the Swan, Major Hartford ordered a second whiskey before lunch and muttered something about ungrateful upstarts and secrets best left buried. Miss Marple visited the forge once more that afternoon. Though sealed, the constable on duty allowed her a brief look under Craddock's instruction. She didn't go inside this time. She only studied the perimeter. A mark in the dirt is a heel print, not recent, but not yet washed away by the rain. Slight, narrow, pointing toward the rear door. Someone had approached from the woods, not the lane. She followed the line with her eyes and found herself staring at the tree line beyond the chapel, where the yews thickened and the gravestones became fewer. It was a natural path, not official. But if one wished to move unseen, later that evening, she met with Craddock in his office above the village station. He looked drawn, tired from too many questions and too few answers. He was killed the day of the fete, Craddock said. The rough time of death puts it between noon and 2. That's why no one noticed. Everyone was distracted. Miss Marple nodded. And the body hidden shortly after? Yes. We found scrape marks on the old stone near the crypt door. Someone dragged him. The wound on the back of the head suggests he was struck from behind, likely with something heavy, perhaps iron. A blacksmith's tools? Possibly. We've searched the forge. One hammer is missing, but it could have been gone for months. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her gaze distant. And the motive? That's where it gets complicated. The land deed points toward Major Hertford's sale of grey pastures. There's something fishy there. But Denham had the most to lose if the sale was invalid. He could be sued for fraud or worse. Iris claims she heard Hertford's name the night before the fete, but we can't be sure. And Walter? Craddock frowned. He's nervous, evasive. But we've no direct evidence linking him to the scene, only that he knew the forge and perhaps knew where Finch hid his secrets. Miss Marple leaned forward gently. There's something people forget in mysteries, Inspector. We look to those who benefit from a death. But we should also ask who feared the truth. Craddock looked puzzled. You mean someone who didn't want something known? Exactly. And Gregory Finch, bless him, was never good at keeping silent. He hinted loudly, even when he meant to be discreet. That letter Iris found? He must have known someone would read it. Craddock sat back in his chair. He baited the hook. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. He was a man of iron and fire. It's not surprising he tried to forge his own justice. Back at her cottage that night, Miss Marple reviewed her notes. She took each suspect in turn. Walter Fleming is timid but sharp, intelligent, slighted, knew the layout of the church and the hiding places in the forge. Lawrence Denham is respectable on the surface, but land law was his livelihood, and Finch's discovery had put that at risk. Major Hertford is prideful and easily angered, with an old history of bitterness. His name is spoken in whispers, and he has no alibi during the fete. And Iris? Not guilty, Miss Marple believed, but she knew more. Perhaps much more. At midnight, she sat back and folded her hands. The killer had left something behind. Not a fingerprint or a tool, but a pattern. And patterns, like people, always told the truth if one knew how to listen. Tomorrow she will begin to ask a different kind of question. Who killed Gregory Finch? But who couldn't afford for him to speak? The next morning arrived with a dull sun rising above the hedgerows, its light doing little to warm the chilled mood that gripped Rosewood. Word of Gregory Finch's murder had settled into the bones of the village like winter frost long before the season. It was no longer a curiosity or whispered scandal. It was a weight, heavy, inescapable. Everyone had known him. Everyone now wondered how well. The forge remained closed, cordoned off by Constable Marks, who stood beside it like a reluctant sentry. The church was likewise silent, its crypt locked once more, the broken stones sealed behind a temporary barrier. And through it all, Miss Marple moved gently and without fanfare, her presence so familiar that most villagers no longer noticed her movements. She called that morning at Grey Pastures. The Denham residence, a respectable stone house that had once been a pride of the village, now sat with its windows closed and its gates squeaking slightly in the breeze. The ivy that grew up its sides had turned autumnal red, as though the house itself blushed at its own secrets. Lawrence Denham answered the door in a pressed shirt and waistcoat, though the creases beneath his eyes and the faint tremble of his hand suggested a restless night. "Miss Marple," he said, stiffly courteous. "I wasn't expecting visitors." "I never presume to arrive unannounced," she replied with a smile. "I was simply walking this way and thought it rather impolite not to inquire after you. These last few days must have been difficult." Denham hesitated for a beat before stepping aside. "Would you care for tea?" "I always care for tea," Miss Marple said pleasantly. The parlor was modest and tidy, though its edges bore the signs of an unsettled house. An opened drawer left slightly ajar, a pile of unopened post, and a scuff mark on the hearth rug that suggested recent pacing. Denham busied himself with the kettle, and Miss Marple took a moment to glance around, her gaze settling briefly on a writing desk beneath the window. When the tea was poured and settled in china cups, she sipped and said lightly, "I do hope the investigation has not disrupted your work too terribly." Denham leaned back, cup in hand, eyes narrowing. "That depends on what one considers a disruption. Inspector Craddock has asked a number of questions. I've answered them, and I'm sure I'll be asked more." "And have you considered asking any questions of your own?" she asked, gently stirring her tea. He looked up sharply. "What do you mean?" "Only that, in a village like this, secrets are rarely solitary. Mr. Finch found something he shouldn't have, and someone went to a great deal of trouble to make sure he couldn't share it. Perhaps it concerned land, perhaps something older, something buried deeper than even the crypt." Denham set his cup down. "You seem to enjoy playing detective." "Not at all," Miss Marple said. "I dislike murder intensely, but I dislike injustice more." He looked away. "If Finch had something on me, I didn't know about it. I bought this property in good faith. If there were improprieties with the previous owner, I wouldn't party with them. The previous owner was Major Hartford." "Yes," Miss Marple nodded. "And you have no knowledge of any dispute between him and Mr. Finch?" Denham hesitated. "Only hearsay. Something to do with land value and right of passage. Hartford has a temper. It's not exactly a secret. I understand the two of you had words some months ago." His jaw tensed. "That's private." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Of course." She didn't stay much longer. When she left, she passed a window that overlooked the rear of the property. A narrow garden path trailed toward the woods, half hidden by the hedges. There were footprints in the earth, faint but distinct, and the heel pattern matched what she'd seen behind the forge. Miss Marple walked the long way back through the village. Her thoughts were piecing themselves together like the final stitches of a tapestry. The land dispute was important, yes, but not central, not quite. Something else had frightened Gregory Finch, something more immediate. Back at her cottage, she took a moment to tend her garden. The dahlias were nearly done, their heads heavy and rich with color, bowing beneath the weight of late bloom. As she clipped a few for drying, her mind drifted not to flowers, but to patterns, the timing, the fate, the letter, the false calm in Iris's voice, Walter's nervousness, Denham's denial, Hartford's indignation. Each piece fit, but the picture they formed was still incomplete. Just after tea, a knock came at the door. It was Walter Fleming. He stood on the threshold, cap in hand, eyes flicking over her shoulder before settling on her with a weary sort of desperation. "Miss Marple," he said, "I'd like to talk. Somewhere quiet." She ushered him inside. They sat at the kitchen table where the kettle had just begun to steam. Walter refused tea. "I'm not here for comfort," he said. "I'm here because I can't live with it anymore." Miss Marple folded her hands. "Go on, Mr. Fleming." "I didn't kill him," he began. "But I knew something was wrong. I didn't say anything. I should have." "What did you know?" He swallowed hard. "Gregory told me he was being followed. He said someone had threatened him. I thought he was imagining things and getting paranoid. He had that deed, and he thought it meant more than it did. I told him to burn it, but he didn't. Number, he said he wanted to hold on to it. Insurance, he called it. But it wasn't just the deed. He had letters about the sale, letters between Hartford and someone else who'd pushed the deal through, someone who wasn't supposed to. Do you know who?" Walter looked down at his hands. "I never saw the name. He wouldn't let me. Have you ever seen someone unusual?" He nodded. "A week before the fete. I came by late to pick up my tools. There was a man there, arguing with him. Tall, dark coat. I didn't see the face. Could it have been Denham? Could have. But the voice didn't sound like him. I thought it might have been Hartford, or someone else entirely. Walter looked up. You think there's someone we've missed? Miss Marple didn't answer. Instead, she stood and retrieved the paper Iris had brought, the note from Gregory Finch. She laid it on the table between them. Don't trust too easily, she read aloud. That's what he wrote. And I wonder, who did he trust too much? Walter left shortly after, pale but lighter, as though confession had loosened something long knotted within him. Miss Marple remained by the hearth. She stared into the embers, and she remembered something. At the fete, just before the maypole dance, a young boy had found a polished horseshoe in the flower bed. A finished one. But 3 had been left half-made on the forged table, which meant a 4th had gone missing. A hammer, a horseshoe. A motive. It wasn't the land. Not truly. It was what Finch had seen in someone. Someone respected. Someone no one would suspect. Someone who had been watching Gregory Finch, not as a rival, but as a threat, and Miss Marple knew, as certainly as she knew roses from weeds, that the killer had been close that day. So close. Too close. The next morning dawned crisp and clear, the kind of autumn day that seems to promise renewal. The rain had washed the village clean, leaving the hedgerows sparkling and the cobbled paths slick but bright. Rosewood, though still under the long shadow of Gregory Finch's death, had begun to stir again. Children resumed their errands. The bakery reopened with its usual queue, and the scent of fresh loaves mingled with the cool air. But beneath the revived rhythms of daily life, something darker still churned, a question unanswered, a truth unspoken. Miss Marple's front gate creaked softly as she stepped into the lane, her knitting basket hanging from one arm and her parasol, mostly for show, held loosely in the other. Her destination this morning was neither the vicarage nor the station, but the green. The village green, once the site of tea tents and maypole ribbons, now lay quiet. The bunting had been removed, the chairs returned to the church hall, and the memory of the fete remained only in the minds of those who had attended. But Miss Marple, ever attuned to detail, believed memories were not the only things that lingered. She moved slowly around the edges of the green, her eyes scanning not the center but the periphery, the places where most people didn't look. It was there, among the roots of the rose bushes and beside the stone wall, that she found it. A small piece of red ribbon, frayed at the edge, caught in a low bramble. She knelt, examined it, and tucked it into her pocket. The maypole dancers had worn red and white ribbons, but this had not been attached to the pole. This was thicker, a waistband, perhaps, or a sash. She stood slowly and moved further along the boundary, stopping at the flower bed where, days ago, a child had found a horseshoe. That child, she recalled, had been Henry Aldridge, the vicar's grandson. Bright boy, always climbing things. She turned and made her way to the vicarage. Reverend Thorne welcomed her with a nod, his eyes more tired than usual. "I've had 2 more villagers come to me in tears this week," he said, ushering her into the drawing room. "One thinks her husband might be suspected next. The other is sure the killer is in her own pew." "Fear does make theologians of us all," Miss Marple said gently. She took a seat and folded her hands. "I've come to ask if I might speak with Henry." The vicar looked surprised, but called upstairs. A few minutes later, the boy descended, his shirt slightly askew, face still rosy from sleep. He smiled when he saw Miss Marple. "You're the lady with the cake tin shaped like a hen," he said brightly. "Indeed I am," she replied. "And you're the clever boy who found something unusual in the rosebed during the fete." "Oh yes," he said proudly. "A horseshoe. But Mum said I had to give it back. Quite right, too. But tell me, Henry, did you see anyone put it there?" He frowned, his brow creasing with effort. "I think so," he said slowly. "Someone in a long coat. Blue, I think." They walked toward the flower bed, but I didn't see their face. I was up in the tree. "Which tree?" He pointed through the window. "That one. The one with the thick branch. You can see almost everything from up there." Miss Marple's eyes followed his finger. The tree in question sat at the northeast corner of the green. From it, one would indeed have a clear view not just of the fete, but of the path toward the forge, the entrance to the chapel, and even the side gate of grey pastures. "Did you see anything else, Henry? Anything odd?" The boy looked uncertain, then nodded. "I saw Mr. Hartford shouting at Uncle Greg, near the vestry, but no one else saw because they were listening to the music." Miss Marple thanked him and handed him a wrapped biscuit from her basket. He beamed. Outside, she paused at the base of the tree and looked up. The bark was scraped in places where small shoes had climbed. The vantage point was remarkable. She could see the forge door, the chapel wall, and, just barely, the rear path through the trees that led to Denham's house. It was all there. The fate had provided more than noise and distraction. It had been a perfect cover. By mid-afternoon, she paid a quiet visit to Inspector Craddock, who had commandeered a small office near the post office while investigations were underway. He was hunched over a map of the village, marking lines with a pencil. "I've been trying to work out the likely path the body was taken," he said. "From the green to the church. There's no straight route." "There wouldn't be," Miss Marple said, taking a seat. "But the route isn't as important as the timing. You said Gregory was killed between noon and 2. Craddock nodded. "Based on the state of the body, yes. Likely just after the maypole ended. Then the killer acted during the moment of peak distraction, and they had to move quickly, which means they already knew where they intended to hide him." Craddock frowned. "That implies premeditation." "It was always premeditated," she said gently. "Only the tool may have been improvised. I believe the horseshoe was used to stage a distraction, not the murder itself." He looked at her sharply. "You think it was planted deliberately?" She pulled the red ribbon from her pocket, and this was left behind at the green, caught in a hedge. Craddock took it, turning it over. "Could be anything." "But it's not anything," she said. "It's from a coat. A woman's coat, I suspect. Or possibly a theatrical costume. And the only person not accounted for during that precise time of the fete, apart from the victim himself, was she let the sentence hang." Craddock's brow furrowed. "Iris?" Miss Marple's expression didn't change. She told us she hadn't seen her uncle since he left to take a walk, but Henry saw him arguing with Major Hartford near the vestry, not in the lane, which means someone is lying about the sequence of events, but if Hartford argued with him, that makes Hartford our man. Miss Marple stood, or it makes him the last person Gregory argued with before going to meet someone else, someone he trusted enough to follow, someone he never thought could hurt him. She reached into her bag and removed a small page, a copy of a letter Gregory Finch had written 2 months earlier, tucked among the receipts in his forge. Craddock took it and read it aloud. "Iris deserves better. I've drafted a new will. I've left the forge to her, but the land goes to the village trust. Too much bitterness around that." Craddock looked up. "Do you think she found out?" "I think," Miss Marple said softly, "that people rarely kill for land. But they often kill to keep the future they believe they're owed." Craddock sat in silence. Outside, the wind rustled the leaves. Somewhere on the green, a single ribbon fluttered loose from the maypole and floated gently to the ground. The fete had ended. But the dance of deception had only just begun. The air had turned sharper by the next morning, the kind of chill that suggested autumn had finally claimed the village with full authority. A silver mist hung low over the green, curling around the hedges and creeping along the footpaths as if reluctant to part with the scene of its secrets. Miss Marple sat by her front window with her teacup cooling in her hand, her gaze fixed not on the morning paper but on the slow passage of people through the lane. She had seen Iris Finch pass earlier, head down, coat tight against her, walking faster than usual toward the forge. Not the chapel, not the station, the forge. That, Miss Marple thought, was telling. The evidence had been trickling in now with undeniable rhythm. The forged land deed, the child's observation from the tree, the red ribbon, the misleading timeline. And now, Gregory Finch's attempt to make peace with the village and provide for his niece had, perhaps, planted the very seed of betrayal. And yet, Miss Marple knew from long practice that certainty, no matter how well constructed, required proof of character. It was never enough to catch someone in a lie. One must observe them in the moment they think they are safe. So it was with a deliberate plan, and not a little grace, that she arranged for Iris to call on her that afternoon. A short note, kindly phrased, inviting her for tea and a quiet chat. Miss Marple added that she had something of her uncle's she thought Iris might like to have. At precisely 4 o'clock, the young woman arrived. Her boots were still damp from the lane, her scarf wind-tossed. But she looked composed, alert even. She stepped inside with a measured politeness, casting brief glances at the modest decor of Miss Marple's parlor, her expression betraying no emotion. "Thank you for seeing me," she said as she accepted the offered chair. "It's been, well, difficult." "Yes," Miss Marple replied gently, pouring the tea. "Loss can often be so tangled with the past that we hardly know what we're mourning." Iris offered a smile, faint but practiced. "You said you had something from Uncle's." Miss Marple reached into a small drawer in the sideboard and pulled out a folded paper. "I thought it might belong to you eventually. I imagine the solicitor will have things sorted soon, but this was given to me by someone who found it hidden in one of Gregory's books. An early draft of his will." Iris's fingers twitched slightly as she took the paper. She read the contents once, then again. The expression that passed over her face was not shock or sorrow. It was calculation brief, flickering, and quickly smothered. "He didn't mention this to me," she said carefully. "No," said Miss Marple. "I expect he wouldn't have." Silence settled for a moment between them, filled only by the quiet tick of the mantel clock and the clink of silver on porcelain. Miss Marple watched her over the rim of her cup. "You were very close to your uncle." Iris nodded. "He raised me, practically from childhood." "And yet," Miss Marple continued softly, "you argued often. I believe you told the inspector he wanted you to marry someone you didn't love." A brief frown flickered across Iris's face. "That's not unusual in a man of his generation." "No, not at all," Miss Marple agreed. "But Gregory Finch wasn't so very traditional, was he? He supported the church but didn't attend regularly. Let you run the accounts, trusted you with deliveries. He valued independence, which makes one wonder why he would push you toward something so conventional." "I don't see what you're implying," Iris said stiffly. Miss Marple set her cup down and leaned forward slightly, her voice still gentle. "I think your uncle discovered something about the sale of grey pastures. Something he believed would hurt someone in the village, perhaps even scandal. He wrote a letter, you know, one that said not to trust too easily. Walter knew part of it, but not all. He was afraid, but he still went to the fete." Iris's eyes darkened. "He didn't tell me about any of that." "No," Miss Marple said. "But he told you something else, didn't he? Something that made you frightened, not for yourself, but for the life you wanted. The life he might have taken away if he changed his will. Or worse, if he left everything to the village." Iris's hands gripped the edge of the chair. "You don't know what you're talking about." Miss Marple reached once more into the drawer and produced the ribbon, gently laying it between them. This was found on the green. caught in a hedge just near the flower bed where the horseshoe was discovered. You wore a coat with a sash that day. Red, like the ribbons, but the sash was gone by evening. Iris stared at it, then looked up. Her eyes had shifted, not pleading, not defiant, but cold. "You think I killed him?" "I think," Miss Marple said slowly, "that he told you about the change in the will, that he planned to undo everything you thought was promised to you. Perhaps he even asked you to help him prepare the final documents. You'd have known when to strike during the dance, when no one would be watching. You could lure him toward the vestry, then to the back of the chapel. You knew the crypt was sealed, but not well. He trusted you." Iris stood abruptly, her tea spilling slightly onto the saucer. "This is ridiculous." Miss Marple didn't move. "And yet, I think you've already decided how to explain it if we confront you formally. Perhaps you'll say you argued and he fell, or that you found him injured and panicked. But what you haven't accounted for is something very simple, Iris." "What?" she snapped. "The horseshoe," Miss Marple said, her voice calm but firm. "You placed it in the flower bed to distract the search, but you polished it too carefully. It was never meant to be used, not really. But it was meant to be noticed. A child found it. But the real mistake was in the order of things. You left 3 unfinished shoes in the forge. One was polished, but Gregory hadn't finished any that morning. He'd planned to. But he never returned from the walk you claim he took." Iris's breath hitched. "You planted the 4th horseshoe. I was with people all afternoon," she said, suddenly desperate. "You can ask anyone." Miss Marple shook her head. "You weren't. The maypole dance, remember? You slipped away and said you were checking on the raffle tickets, but there's no one who actually saw you return until just after 2 o'clock. There was silence. Then Iris sat down slowly, her shoulders slackening. Her voice, when she spoke, was barely audible. "He was going to give it away," she said. "The land, the forge, everything, to the village, a trust. He said I wasn't practical, that I was too emotional, that I needed protecting from myself." Miss Marple said nothing. "I wasn't going to hurt him. Not at first. But when he told me, when he said I'd have nothing, just a few small savings and a promise he'd always meant to change the will back, I saw red." She looked down at her hands. "It was so fast. I had the hammer. It was just there. I thought he'd leave. I thought he'd let me talk him out of it. But he called me a child." She looked up, her face pale and exhausted. "I dragged him into the crypt because it was the only place I knew no one went. Then I went to the fete and smiled and handed out lemonade." Miss Marple stood and moved to the window. "It's always the small things, my dear. The misplaced item, the too shiny object. The lie was told with just a bit too much ease." Craddock entered a few minutes later, summoned quietly by a note Miss Marple had sent earlier. He made no show of handcuffs, no loud declarations. He simply placed a hand on Iris's shoulder and read her rights. Miss Marple watched her go, without joy, only quiet reflection. Outside, the mist had lifted. The village would return to itself in time. But something had changed, not just in Iris or in the forge, but in the very heartbeat of Rosewood. Miss Marple returned to her knitting. The pattern, at last, was complete. A week passed. The village of Rosewood, as villages so often do, began to settle once more into its rhythms. The forge remained closed, its doors chained not by crime, but by circumstance. There would be no more ringing hammer strokes from Gregory Finch, no more peppermint offerings or metal-shod shoes resting outside the parish gate. The man himself had been laid to rest in the churchyard he had once maintained, in a quiet ceremony attended by nearly the entire village. Even those who'd spoken against him, or, more accurately, gossiped about him, had wept. Miss Marple, dressed in her sober grey coat and felt hat, had stood at the rear of the crowd, her hands gently folded at her waist, head bowed. She made no speeches, offered no grand revelations. That moment had passed. The truth was known, and truth, unlike gossip, had a certain finality. Iris Finch had not resisted arrest. There was no drawn-out trial, no dramatic protestations of innocence. She confessed quietly but completely, sparing the village the agony of speculation. She would be held at the county facility until trial, though Craddock suspected a plea would be arranged. The news had left the village stunned, then subdued. For all her aloofness, Iris had been familiar. Her face, her voice, and her presence at fete and council meetings had been part of the background hum of daily life. To think that such cruelty had lived just beneath the surface, it had left a lasting unease in its wake. In the days following, the village wrapped itself in routine as a wounded creature might wrap around a healing limb. The bakery opened its doors earlier. The school bell rang on time. Even the postmistress, Mrs. Dalrymple, whose appetite for drama had been unusually silent during the crisis, returned to her sharp-tongued opinions, albeit with less certainty. But beneath it all, there was reflection. People spoke in lower tones, they thought before they whispered, and Miss Marple, as ever, remained the one constant, a quiet sentinel of human truth, knitting by her window, listening when others talked too much, and speaking only when something needed saying. One morning, Reverend Thorne came to call. He brought with him a small parcel, wrapped in brown paper and string. It was found in Gregory's workroom, he explained, setting it on the table. A few personal effects. Craddock thought you might know best where they should go. Miss Marple nodded and opened the parcel gently. Inside were several small items: a worn leather-bound notebook filled with measurements and forged schedules, a pencil sharpened down to a stub, a brass compass, and a photograph. She lifted the photo. It was old, black and white, and faded at the edges. Gregory, younger, smiling. A teenage Iris beside him, gangly and uncertain, but beaming. Behind them stood the forge, gleaming in the sun, and to the left a banner hung for some forgotten festival. Miss Marple placed the photo aside, her fingers lingering on it a moment longer. He truly loved her, the Reverend said quietly. Yes, she replied. And she loved him. Love doesn't always wear kindness. Sometimes it's bruised by disappointment, twisted by expectation, but it was there. Do you think she regrets it? He asked. Miss Marple considered. She regrets what it cost her, but the choice she made at that moment, she acted, made it clear-eyed. She saw a version of her future slipping away and tried to hammer it back into shape, fitting in a way. She used his tools. Reverend Thorne looked down at the notebook. She might have been something quite special. She was, Miss Marple said, but people are often many things all at once. That afternoon, Miss Marple visited the forge for the final time. Constable Marks, who now stood more from habit than necessity, gave her a polite nod and unhooked the latch. Inside, the forge was still as a mausoleum. The hearth was cold, the tools in perfect order. It felt like a stage abandoned after the last act. The drama concluded, and the characters dismissed. She moved to the workbench and opened the leather ledger once more. There were Gregory's final notes, new clients, upcoming repairs, and a list of materials to order. But on the last page, written in his neat but steady hand, was something else. A quote. She read it aloud to herself. What is done cannot be undone, but what is left can still be shaped. No attribution, just words, quiet and honest. She closed the book. Outside, a breeze had begun to rise. Leaves danced across the chapel steps, and bells from the steeple began to toll the quarter hour. The sound echoed across the green, where a few children now played without concern, their laughter high and clear in the thinning air. As she made her way back toward the cottage, Miss Marple was stopped by Major Hertford, who tipped his hat. "Well, you were right in the end," he said, not unkindly. "Never would have guessed it. Not in 1,000 years." "That is often how it is," she replied. "The most shocking things come wrapped in ordinary paper. I suppose I'll have to stop accusing Walter Fleming, then. That would be kind." Hertford gave a gruff laugh and shook his head. "The village will be quiet for a while now, until the next scandal." She smiled. "Let us hope it involves nothing more sinister than a missing chicken." He laughed again, and they parted ways. Back home, Miss Marple placed the notebook, the compass, and the photograph into a small wooden box. She tied it with fresh twine and labeled it in her delicate hand. To be kept in memory of Gregory Finch, honest smith of Rosewood. She placed it on her shelf beside the box marked Unsolved Curiosities, and another for clippings of note. Outside, the village hummed with the slow, patient song of recovery. There would be fetes again and maypoles, jam competitions and parochial spats. There would be young people in love and old rivalries that smouldered under tea-table smiles. And, inevitably, there would be secrets. But Rosewood would endure, because villages, like people, learn to carry both grief and grace. And Miss Marple, sitting by her window with her knitting and her thoughts, would remain as ever quietly watching, always listening, not to punish, but to understand.